Hello again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Critical Thinking Lesson videos. This one will be about evaluation. What we're going to do is we're going to introduce the term and then describe it with two different examples. Remember, the purpose of these lessons is so that you can understand this critical thinking concept and use it later in your own writing. To evaluate something means to judge it for its value, credibility, significance, or worth. Basically, you have to decide, is the thing good, and should you use it in the given situation? You must decide what would work given the specific situation, as the situation is very important here. If you're making a big decision or you're planning something out, it's often not helpful to make a broad evaluation across many different categories. But sometimes with academic sources, it is helpful to do so, and we'll get to that later. Whatever you do, make sure your evaluation is based on evidence and context, as in what evidence is important given the context. As an analogy, think of the things you're evaluating having an arm wrestling contest. Often it'll be pro or con or yes or no. The evidence that's behind the winner should be stronger in all or most cases, and the one that you should evaluate or put your bets behind should be the stronger one. So ask yourself, if these two choices were having this arm wrestling contest, which one do I think would win? Your Odyssey warm-up from the end of that unit asked you to evaluate a certain sentence, and that sentence was, "The gods are empathetic and patient." Remember, to evaluate means to judge something for how good it is, how useful it is, given the situation you have. So, based on your knowledge of the story of the Odyssey, evaluate the above quote for credibility, and credibility is believability or truth. Again, the things we need to keep in mind are the situation and the evidence. The situation is the Odyssey is an epic poem, and it's a fictional text. The information is everything that the gods have done to Odysseus and to other characters throughout the story. So how can we use this information to come to a decision? The first thing we need to take note of is the situation. And in this instance, the situation is an academic purpose. We are evaluating this sentence for academic reasons. Because it's an academic purpose, that gives us a little bit more freedom to make a broad evaluation of the sentence. Because the gods are from a fictional literary work, and they're not real people. If we were talking about real people, we wouldn't want to make such a broad assumption, because in life you can interact with many people, and making a broad assumption that all people like this are empathetic and patient, or all people like that are not empathetic and not patient, wouldn't be helpful to ourselves and wouldn't be helpful to the people we talk to. Again, because it's a fictional text and an academic purpose we're using, we can look through the text because everything these characters could possibly do is already in the text. They cannot do anything that is not already laid out for them. The information we have that we can base our evaluation upon is located throughout the epic poem. We can look at all the interactions the gods have with Odysseus and with other characters in order to decide if the gods are empathetic and patient is a credible sentence. But let's look at the three gods who interact with Odysseus the most. There's Athena, who is sometimes very helpful to Odysseus, but sometimes Athena ignores Odysseus. There is Poseidon, who acts with great wrath towards Odysseus throughout the whole poem. And then there's Zeus, who is sometimes helpful to Odysseus, sometimes ignores him, and sometimes acts out against him. So we've got these three major figures who all act mostly negatively towards Odysseus, even though they do some kind things. So we need to use that evidence to make an overarching evaluation of the empathy and patience of the gods. So let's put all that together. What do our academic situation and our examples we went over say about the gods in general? Are they empathetic and patient or not? As you might have guessed, the gods are not empathetic and not patient people. So therefore we can say that the phrase that we were given is not a credible phrase. the gods are empathetic and patient people is not true, because more often than not in the Odyssey, the gods either act with great vengeance or indifference towards Odysseus. Evaluation will be very useful when you're writing research papers because you will need to evaluate every single source you come across. You will need to decide what is there that makes it a good source and what is there that makes it a bad source. So that's pros and cons. Regardless of how good or bad a source is, you will need to decide whether it goes well with the topic of your paper. It could be a very, very strong source, but if it doesn't match the theme or the topic or the purpose of your paper, it will not go well with what you're writing and it will end up dragging your paper down. You also need to make sure that it goes well with the rest of the sources you have. They may all be very strong sources, but if you choose one source that argues against what the rest of your sources say, your paper will end up arguing against itself and getting confused. When you're evaluating these sources, make sure you use those approved information sources only. That will help you make sure your paper argues very well what you're saying. If you end up using something that is a sketchy source, or if it has good information but not well supported, you will carry over those flaws into your paper. And if someone were to evaluate your paper, they could see those flaws and say that your paper is not a good paper and discredit it. So let's get back to that dragon paper we're pretending to write. We said that the sources we expected to find would likely be about dragon legends, the history of dragon legends, and different cultures' understanding of dragons and dragon myths. So let's look at 3 example sources and evaluate those sources to decide whether or not we should use them in our paper. Here are 3 example sources for us. Let's start right at the top. Our first source is called Antarctic People's Depictions of Dragons in Ancient Art. It's written by somebody named Nick Rosenberg, and it's a self-published book. This may sound like something that will work for you, but after some research you realize that there are no civilizations in Antarctica. No ancient civilizations are ever proven to have ever existed in Antarctica. So how could Nick Rosenberg have possibly written a whole book about something that is not proven to have ever existed? Looking at the book, you notice that it's a self-published book. Now, a self-published book is something that the author published and paid for themselves. It was not published by a company. What this means is that nobody necessarily looked at the book and approved it. Somebody might have approved it, but we can't prove that for certain. We can't say that anyone who actually knows what they're talking about has ever looked at this book. So, based on all those factors, we can say that this is very likely not a good source for us to use. Now on to the second one. It's an article in a popular magazine, and it's called The Role of the Steam Engine in Dragon Mythology. It's written by someone with a doctorate, Dr. Shayla Smith. Someone with a doctorate very likely knows what they're talking about. Also, this article was published in a popular magazine. Now, popular magazines aren't going to have as high standards as, say, academic magazines or academic journals, but that doesn't mean that this source is trash right from the get-go. The only thing that has got you wondering when you look at this source is the title, The Role of the Steam Engine in Dragon Mythology. You think that steam engines, steam trains, are a relatively new invention compared to dragon legends, which are thousands and thousands of years old. So you decide, maybe this is a good source, and you're going to take a second look at it to see if it knows what it's saying and if you can use it. Now, lastly, our third source is called The Evolution of Dragon Legends from Cave Paintings to Modern Fantasy. It's by Taylor Hannigan and is published by a reputable publisher. This is probably our best source yet. A reputable publisher will have editors who can look at books and approve that the information they contain is correct before they hit the shelves. And the title seems like something that will be very valuable to you. The Evolution of Dragon Legends. That's exactly what you're looking at, how dragon legends have changed over time. It also tells you how they have changed from the very beginning to the very end. So this is likely a source that you will use throughout your essay. Let's review. Our first source, when we evaluated it, we decided that we should not use it in our paper. It is not a credible source, it is not a valuable source, and we don't even need to look at it because it's not helpful to us and we don't need it in our paper. After evaluating our second source, we said we might use it in our paper. So we're going to need to read that source, take another look at it, take a closer look at it, and then once we have more information, do another evaluation to see if we should include it in our paper after we know more. Our third source, after evaluating it, we said yes, we should definitely use it in our paper. It is credible, it is topical, it is relevant, it is a very good source for us to include. So this is going to be our favorite source moving forward for our paper. What's very important with evaluation and all types of critical thinking is to be able to explain yourself, but also to your reader. So you need to go through each step of your thought process and see if each step makes sense, and be able to understand your own thought process enough that you can explain your thought process. Something that you can ask yourself as part of this is, would another person agree with you? So if another person had the same information, the same situation as you did, would they come to the same conclusion you did in your evaluation? If not, ask yourself why not. Is it because you've allowed some of your own biases to leak into it? Is it because you think there could be more than one correct answer? Or is it because there is an error in context or in evidence? Now, if you think there might be room for interpretation or room for more than one right answer, be very careful, because when it comes to evaluation, usually it is just one right answer. Even if there is good information in a bad source, it is still a bad source overall, and you still shouldn't use it in your paper. All of this is part of metacognition. Again, that's thinking about your own thinking. It is when you evaluate your own thinking. So that's an evaluation within an evaluation. You have to decide for yourself whether your own thinking is valid or whether you should revise it. Something that you can ask yourself as you're trying to explain yourself is how the choice might work out should you pick it. If we picked our Antarctica source for the dragon paper, it would harm our paper. It would be a negative impact. And if you see yourself being harmed that badly by choosing a source, maybe you should be more careful about choosing it if you were leaning towards that Antarctica source. And finally, to bring it back to our analogy of the arm wrestling, which arm do you think is stronger and why? The choice you pick should be much stronger than the choice you don't pick, so it should have a lot of pros and few cons. Be very careful when you're doing this, because if it's got a lot of very small pros but one big con, then the other side is in fact the stronger one. So you've got to balance your pros and your cons and decide which one has the most pro and the least con given the situation. So different weights for different cons and pros will help you to decide this factor. Finally, throughout and at the end of your evaluation process, make sure to ask yourself these questions. First, is your choice sound? Does it actually make sense given the context and the evidence you have? Also, make sure you consider the pros and cons and ask yourself, what are the pros, what are the cons? Weigh them against each other to see if this is truly the best evaluation you should be making. Make sure also to ask yourself about the specific situation and the intended outcome, because sometimes if you change those things, it can change the best choice you should be making. Given an academic or a personal situation and positive or negative outcomes you might find, that can totally change what evaluation you would make and what final option you would end up selecting. Finally, to tie it back into that arm wrestling analogy, ask yourself whether your choice would win. This is to make sure that you're not choosing something because it's your favorite thing or it's because it's what you want to do, when in fact it's not the best thing you should be doing and not the best thing you should be selecting. So your evaluation should not be based on your personal choice, but on the pros and the cons, the actual facts of what is the best choice to make.